In 1976, a 23-year-old jingle writer from Yonkers sat alone in a studio and played every single instrument on a record himself. He mailed a demo tape to every label in New York City. Almost all of them ignored it. The one label that said yes told him to invent a band he didn't have, and gave that fake band a name that already belonged to someone else. They had to change it 2 days after the record came out. That record went to #1. A year later, it appeared in one of the most famous opening scenes in cinema history, introducing the world to a young man named John Travolta walking down a Brooklyn street like he owned the planet. The film it soundtracked became the best-selling soundtrack album ever recorded at that point. And the man who wrote the song that opened it went back to writing television jingles, while everyone else took the credit. This is the story of the most unlikely #1 in the history of disco. A classically trained kid, a fake band, a borrowed genius, and the song that hijacked Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and put it on the dance floor. Chapter 1. The Kid Who Studied with the Masters. Walter Murphy did not come from the world of disco. He came from a world that couldn't have been further from Studio 54. He grew up in New York City, a child prodigy at the keyboard, talented enough to study with Rosa Rio, a concert pianist of serious reputation. He went on to the Manhattan School of Music, where he trained formally in jazz and classical composition. He was not a disco kid. He was a musician's musician, steeped in the structures and rules of the concert hall, the kind of player who knew Beethoven not as a reference but as a blueprint. And then, like most serious musicians who need to eat, he got a day job. He went to work writing advertising jingles and doing arrangements for Doc Severinsen's orchestra on The Tonight Show. Solid, well-paid, invisible work. The kind of career that uses up talented people without leaving a mark. That should have been the whole story. A classically trained New York musician making other people's music for other people's purposes, skilled and anonymous. But in 1976, someone gave him a throwaway suggestion that changed everything. Chapter 2. The idea nobody thought was serious. He was writing a disco track for a commercial, routine work, when the producer he was working with made an offhand remark. Nobody had updated classical music for the disco era, the producer said. Nobody had done that lately. Why not try it? It was the kind of suggestion people make all the time without meaning anything by it. Murphy could have let it pass. Instead, he went away and thought about it seriously, the way a trained musician thinks about things. He'd been interested since college in pop songs that drew on classical sources. The idea wasn't entirely new to him. But nobody had taken a full classical masterpiece and rebuilt it on a disco chassis. He sat down and recorded a demo tape. 4 songs. 3 were ordinary pop songs he'd written. The 4th was a disco reworking of the opening movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. He played nearly every instrument on it himself. Then he packaged it up and mailed it to record labels across New York City. The 3 pop songs generated no interest from anyone. Every label that responded focused on the Beethoven track and nothing else. Most of them still said no. But one label owner, a man named Larry Uttle who ran a small independent called Private Stock Records, heard something in it and said yes. Murphy had a deal. He had a song. What he didn't have was a band, and Uttle was about to insist he invent one. Chapter 3. The Fake Band with Somebody Else's Name. Uttle believed the record would sell better if it appeared to come from a group, rather than a lone individual. This was a common enough piece of industry logic in the 1970s. Bands felt more legitimate than solo acts, especially unknown ones. So he told Murphy to come up with a name. They settled on Walter Murphy and the Big Apple Band. It suggested a New York ensemble which felt right for the sound. Murphy was annoyed by it. He'd played virtually every instrument on the record himself, and the Big Apple Band was a fiction, but he went along with it. The record was released on May 29, 1976, and 2 days later, someone noticed a problem. There was already a Big Apple Band. They were a New York group with their own recordings and their own name, and they hadn't been consulted. Private stock had to act fast. The name on the label was changed first to the Walter Murphy Band, and then eventually just to Walter Murphy. As for the other Big Apple band, the real one, they decided to rename themselves entirely to avoid the confusion. They chose a new name, Chic. So the administrative mess of Walter Murphy's fake band accidentally triggered the naming of one of the most important acts in the history of disco. That's how tangled and accidental this whole era was. Chapter 4. The slowest climb to number 1. A Fifth of Beethoven entered the Billboard Hot 100 on May 29, 1976, at number 80, and it climbed. Slowly, steadily, without a publicity machine, without a famous face attached to it, without a band to put on a poster or a television show. It took 19 weeks to reach the top. Week by week, radio programmers who had been skeptical of a disco instrumental built on a 159-year-old symphony discovered that their audiences couldn't get enough of it. The four-note motif that Beethoven had written in Vienna in 1808, the phrase so famous it had become the universal shorthand for the entire idea of classical music, turned out to work perfectly underneath a pulsing disco groove. The urgency that Beethoven had built into those notes translated directly to the dance floor. It didn't need lyrics. It didn't need a singer. It just needed a beat and a string section and the most recognizable opening in the history of Western music. On October 3, 1976, 19 weeks after it first appeared on the chart, it reached number 1. A solo musician with a fake band name and a borrowed genius had made the most unlikely number 1 of the year. The single sold 2 million copies. Murphy was 23 years old. And then, before the dust had even settled on that achievement, something much bigger came knocking. Chapter 5. The scene that made it immortal. In 1977, a director named John Badham was putting the finishing touches on a film about a young man from Brooklyn who worked in a paint store all week and became a king on the dance floor on Saturday nights. The film needed an opening. It needed something to announce itself, to set the tone before a single word of dialogue was spoken. Badham chose A Fifth of Beethoven. The scene that followed became one of the most famous in cinema history. John Travolta in a white suit, walking down a Brooklyn street with a swagger that said everything about who Tony Manero was and who he wanted to be. The camera catches his shoes, his paint can, his face. And underneath it all, Murphy's disco Beethoven drives the whole thing forward. The film was Saturday Night Fever. Its soundtrack sold over 40 million copies and became, at that point in history, the best-selling soundtrack album ever made. It sat at number 1 on the American Albums chart for 24 straight weeks. It won the Grammy for Album of the Year, and the name credited most often when people talk about that soundtrack. The name that became synonymous with Saturday Night Fever and with disco itself was the Bee Gees. Because the Bee Gees had written Stayin' Alive and Night Fever and How Deep Is Your Love, and those songs were everywhere. Murphy's contribution, the song that literally opened the film, the first sound the audience heard in the most important disco movie ever made, was a footnote. His name appeared in the credits. His song played over Travolta's most iconic moment, and then the conversation moved on without him. Chapter 6. Back to the jingles. Murphy tried to repeat the trick. Of course he did. He followed A Fifth of Beethoven with a disco reworking of Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee, which reached number 44. He tried Gershwin. He tried Bolero. He tried Mozart. Nothing ever came close to the original. Because here's the thing about lightning in a bottle. It only strikes once, and it usually strikes on something nobody intended. The Beethoven record wasn't a calculated strategy. It was a jingle writer goofing around with a producer's offhand suggestion, playing all the instruments himself in an empty studio, mailing a demo tape into the void. That kind of accident doesn't repeat on demand. So Walter Murphy went back to what he knew. He wrote music for television. He arranged, he composed, he worked in the background. And eventually, decades later, he found a new collaborator who valued exactly what he did. A writer and producer named Seth MacFarlane, who hired him to compose the music for a new animated comedy series. That series was Family Guy. Murphy wrote and produced its score for over 20 years. Hundreds of millions of people have heard his music without knowing his name, which is, when you think about it, exactly what his whole career has been. So here is what Walter Murphy actually did. He took the most recognizable 4 notes in the history of classical music, put them on a dance floor, and made them number 1. He opened the most famous disco movie ever made. He sold 2 million copies of a record built on a fake band's borrowed name. And then he disappeared back into the background, writing music that other people's names get attached to, which turns out to be what he was always going to do anyway. Beethoven died in 1827 and never made a cent in royalties. Murphy hit number 1 at 23 and never hit the top 40 again. The song they both made together, one of them dead for 149 years, the other armed with a demo tape and an empty studio, is still playing on dance floors more than 50 years later. Some stories don't have a tidy ending. They just have a great song that refuses to stop. Now we want to hear from you. What's the most unexpected number 1 you remember from the disco era? The one that made you think, how on earth did that make it to the top? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and the best stories become the next video.